E-I-E-I-O. We would cluck, cluck here and cluck, cluck there. We would cluck there, cluck everywhere, a cluck, cluck. L. MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O.
Anymore, Old MacDonald's family farm is hard to find. In reality, most of our poultry, pork, and beef are now produced in massive industrial operations called factory farms, or CAFOs, short for confined animal feeding operations. We are focusing our attention on CAFOs, or factory farms, because they are the source of 95% of the poultry we buy in stores today, and the majority of the beef and pork sold in those stores. The factory farm model is a production model which is spreading worldwide. Although there are some exceptions, the problems we discuss are prevalent in most of these facilities. On a number of health and environmental issues, the European Union, Japan, and Australia have adopted standards that are far stronger than the ones we see in the U.S. and most of the rest of the world. The health and environmental problems created by these facilities are so severe that the American Public Health Association has called for a moratorium on new operations, and an environmental watchdog group, the World Watch Institute, issued a report in 2006 in which it warned that factory farms were turning into mini Chernobyls because of the vast pollution created by these facilities. Considering our own history in the Western world, you would think that we would understand that urbanizing large populations without adequate sewage treatment would result in health risk on a massive scale. In the mid-19th century, Europe had to deal with the terrifying and unintended consequences of industrialization. Cities that used to have thousands of occupants now had millions, and the old methods of handling human sewage by selling it to farmers as fertilizer no longer worked. The massive accumulation of waste contaminated drinking water, and London and other major cities in the industrial world had to face the terror of cholera epidemics. In London alone, over 15,000 men, women, and children died in just 1 year. The result was governmental action which created the first modern sewage system. The turn of the 20th century saw the mechanization and industrialization of meat processing, which led to one of the greatest scandals in modern times, documented by Upton Sinclair in his book, The Jungle. The resulting passage of reform legislation brought federal control and health standards to the meat processing industry for the first time. Meat production, however, the actual growth of chickens, cows, and pigs, remained largely an economy dominated by thousands of small family farms until late in the 20th century. Federal Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz issued a call for farmers to get big or get out. And by the end of the 20th century, poultry and meat production was dominated by a few giant corporations who produced their products in large factory farms with hundreds of thousands of animals crammed into small spaces. Animal waste that used to be productively recycled as fertilizer now accumulates in such vast quantities that it has a toxic impact that stretches far beyond the land and water immediately surrounding these facilities. Recent decades had seen American Peace Corps volunteers spread across the planet, teaching natives in undeveloped areas the dangers of putting waste in or near drinking water. Unfortunately, no Peace Corps volunteers were sent to teach our own corporations how to protect the water and air around their operations. We were willing to teach others the lessons learned in the epidemics of the 19th century. Unfortunately, we haven't been willing to learn those lessons ourselves. Our first view of the devastation of these large operations came in America's heartland, the rural counties of northeast Oklahoma, northwest Arkansas, and southwest Missouri. Over 1 billion chickens are produced here each year in thousands of chicken houses. Each house contains an average of 25,000 chickens. The resulting damage to a landscape that once included pristine lakes and streams is painfully obvious.
Works south of 10 killer much. Holy shit. Holy shit. Look at the cladabra. It's this big, long, stringy filamentous algae. It's what's growing right on the river bottom down there, and that is unbelievable.
We've had lots of water, mountains, streams around here, and it's been polluted from that time now, and it's still being polluted. And I understand that Oklahoma wants to make tourism one of the chief industries in the state of Oklahoma. And in order to do that, we need some control over pollution in our territory. If the lakes get polluted, we won't be able to swim in it. We won't be able to eat fish out of it. You have air pollution as well as water pollution around. And we have a lot of people with asthma and some related diseases.
The experience over there is horrible. Pollution's just terrible. There's stuff floating in the river. I wouldn't eat anything that came out of that river.
The blue-green algae is known worldwide. It's a whole group of species, and certain ones of them produce toxins that are dangerous to have in drinking water or dangerous if you get in the water where the toxin is being released. The fish life is basically no longer there. We don't find people in it swimming, wading, fishing. I haven't seen anyone fish in it in a long, long time. It used to be a common gathering point for people in the neighborhood.
And as a kid, we would go a half a dozen dimes out in the stream and would dive down and find them. Today, there's no way that could happen.
Well, Riley, here we are in the middle of the stream as it comes up, and this is an example. We'll go back up and take a closer look. This is an example of the way that the bottom ought to look, right?
That's right. You should be able to see the color of the rock. This one's white, has angles that you can easily see. Doesn't have a lot of green and brown over it.
Right, and then this rock right here, but this is one that shows you just how completely covered with algae that is.
Yes, all this green shouldn't be there.
We talked with Drew Edmondson, who is the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma. Edmondson has filed a lawsuit against several major poultry companies, including Tyson, Cobb Van Trees, Cal-Maine Foods, Cargill, George's Farms, Peterson Farms, Semin Foods, and Willowbrook Foods. In the lawsuit, Attorney General Edmondson seeks not only damages, but injunctive relief against the further spreading of waste in northeastern Oklahoma.
My first meeting with the poultry industry was November of 2001, and we went through 2002, 2003, 2004, having meetings in Arkansas and in Oklahoma. And during that time period, we were simply asking the companies to accept responsibility for removing from the basin the amount of litter that could not be safely land applied. You know, you put down what you need to fertilize the crop, and anything above that needs to be removed from the basin. You put down more than the crops need, and it's going to run off into the water. They steadfastly refused to agree to take that responsibility. There are times when Lake Tenkiller today is 70% oxygen dead. There are times when in 70% of the water, fish can't live. The wildlife department stocks the Illinois River below Tenkiller Lake with trout. And then periodically, when there's water released from Lake Tenkiller into the lower Illinois River, it is so oxygen depleted that the trout that we stocked drown.
I was told by a former politician in Grand Lake back when I first arrived here that environmentalists are the worst thing that could ever happen to Grand Lake. We're worse than any pollution that could be in the lake. And I said, well, tell me how that works. And he said, because you go around telling everybody what's going wrong, and you publicize it, you get it in the paper, and then people won't come to grow, they won't come to the lake, they won't, and that'll ruin all of these businesses. And I said, well, that's some really narrow, short-term thinking, don't you think? Because in a few years, it's going to be so painfully obvious it's going to happen, and you did nothing about it.
There's a bill in Congress today that would amend the federal legislation that we've relied upon in part in our lawsuit, and say that under no circumstances are animal waste to be considered hazardous. No matter what they're mixed with, and no matter what's in them, no matter what may have been added to the feed that would then come out the other end, under no circumstances, and regardless of the amount, would animal waste be considered hazardous. Congress does some pretty stupid things now and again, but this would be one of the stupidest they've ever done. Chemicals, processes, compounds are either hazardous or they're not. If they are hazardous, you can legislate that word away, but you can't legislate away the hazard. You know, one of the constituents in poultry waste is arsenic. You know, it'd be like Congress saying arsenic is not dangerous. Help yourself. The damage from the waste being transported across Oklahoma, nuclear waste or hazardous waste or otherwise, was theoretical. If there was an accident, if there was a leak, if there was a train wreck, you know, if there was a truck crash, then you could have an environmental problem. We know we've got an environmental problem with what's happening in the poultry industry. It's not theoretical. And what we're putting on the ground on an annual basis in the Illinois River Basin in terms of phosphorus, to equal it with human sewage would take the untreated waste of 10.7 million human beings. And if anyone proposed taking that much human waste and simply spreading it on the land to get rid of it, people would think they were crazy. But that's what we're doing with poultry waste.
Environmental and health damage is not confined to a few states. It reaches across the country. It doesn't just come from poultry operations, but from confined pig and cattle operations as well. We visited the Chesapeake Bay, which has suffered significant damage from industrial agricultural operations, including large-scale poultry farms.
What happens on the land affects the water. 1997, we were hit with a real health emergency. Not just a thing that was occurring over years, but people getting very, very sick and having serious neurological problems. And what happened was that in the spring of 1997, the Department of Natural Resources and the Health Department started getting some reports of massive fish kills. It was Labor Day weekend. In fact, it was the end of August when the health officer for the state and the Secretary of Natural Resources said they need to see me almost on an emergency basis. And they came in and reported that a number of people who had been exposed to the water in these rivers were getting very, very sick. It was skin irritations, it was coughing, but most importantly, it was actual neurological impact. Inability to remember, inability to coordinate carefully, and so on. And what they said is that something in the river was not only killing the fish, but now starting to affect the watermen and potentially anyone that had direct contact with this. But we found out subsequently that it was a little-known organism called Pfiesteria.
Pfiesteria, this very, very interesting form of algae that takes on multiple different forms, and that one form that emerges under conditions of high nutrient load, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, actually produces a toxin that's not just toxic to fish. Because the fish were dying not just because of lack of oxygen, but they had these big ugly ulcers on their scales and the skin of the fish, but that these same toxins seemed to be harming the watermen, that there were reports of various neurologic disorders, and some scientists at North Carolina State University actually experimentally were demonstrating some neurotoxicity of Pfiesteria toxins.
For about 9 or 10 years after my exposure, I had chronic bronchitis, onset of pneumonia repeatedly, symptoms that suggested some immune system compromise. The other problem that I had early on from the toxin, and a couple of other folks did as well in laboratory settings, was that I lost my ability to learn, to lay down new memory. It manifested as an Alzheimer's-like effect, so that I had long-term memory but couldn't remember anything about where I was in a room, why I was there, that sort of thing. It's been described as a person having lucid moments and realizing that something is just terribly wrong and then just sinking back down again. And when I realized that I couldn't remember how to dial my telephone number unless I looked at every digit as I was dialing it, it was really a frightening sort of experience.
The runoff from the chicken farms and the high phosphorus level, and the chicken, well, since this is a family production, we'll say the chicken litter,
Right.
In fact created a certain condition that caused the reaction in this ancient organism, Pfiesteria, that made it toxic.
We began to wonder how the American production system compared with the rest of the world. Could this possibly be the best practice for producing our food? We went to the World Conference on Agricultural Engineering in Bonn, Germany to find out. There we discovered a European system far advanced from ours.
Our companies should not try to get out of the intensive areas here in Europe and bring the problems to other countries. For example, cheap exportation from Brazil has led down there that Rio do Peixes, which is the river of fishes, is without any fish because they have very, very intensive chicken farms down there.
Environmental problems, if they occur here, and the physics and the chemics, they are the same in Russia, in the US, wherever. So why don't they have to deal with the same regulations?
Let's compare European policies and realities with our own. When we do, we discover a shocking truth. The United States is far behind the rest of the industrial world in protecting its food supply, its environment, and the health of its citizens. Why does the U.S. allow so many practices that are prohibited elsewhere in the modern world? Taking into account what scientists tell us about existing practices and some of the lessons we can learn from other countries, how would this industry do if it had to face a real report card? What grades would it get on issues that matter most to our food supply, the environment, and our health?
Ammonia can be hazardous. It's a source of nitrogen for receiving bodies of water. Ammonia goes in the atmosphere. It's altered to ammonium sulfate or something like that. Comes down usually pretty close by.
Ammonia is clearly emerging as a significant air pollutant that does bad things to the respiratory system. There are also real problems with the animals themselves, that high levels of ammonia are associated with respiratory disease.
We're in the middle of the shed and we're going to test the level of ammonia in the air at the bird's level. The ammonia level is 72 parts per million.
I've seen figures that, literally graphics that show a plume of ammonia generation in eastern North Carolina that wasn't there 20 years ago. And it's animal waste generating that, for sure.
Over the last 10 years, we have really tracked closely water quality in one of our local estuaries. There's been more than a 500% increase in ammonia in North Carolina estuaries.
High concentrations do have a very negative effect on the health of the animals and the workers. So that's one reason you really should try to avoid high indoor concentrations. And if you look on the emissions which come out of a facility, then they will cause acid rain, eutrophication and things like that. So there's a very high concern in Europe about these ones, and that's one of the reasons, for example, that the member states of the European Union tried to develop a time schedule, how much of this ammonia emissions have to be reduced in a certain time frame.
There are some calculations about ammonia production that the highly regulated chemical producers of ammonia are now contributing less ammonia to the atmosphere than are the big CAFOs.
There's an immediate health problem from being exposed to too much of it. It acts as a base when it gets into your lungs, and it can do lung damage. And of course it's noxious. I mean, you know right away when you've been exposed to ammonia. That's right, yeah, you know right away. No mystery about that. But there's an environmental impact from it as well.
More than 80% of the total ammonia emissions in Germany come from from agriculture and animal production. Therefore, if we look for mitigation strategies, they really focus on agriculture because there is the biggest force. So that also means there's the highest chance to reduce these ones.
EPA come up with a CAFO designation, which is anything over 125,000 chickens. And so trying to stay out of more regulations, I've reduce my capacity below the CAFO threshold, which is, I'm just putting in about 24,800 per house each flock.
Union of Concerned Scientists did some calculation on data a couple of years ago that suggested that 23 million pounds of antibiotics per year are used in veterinary practice, most of it in subtherapeutic doses added to animal feed for growth enhancement.
Not only the World Health Organization, but the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Public Health Association, essentially every major leading public health medical authority has come out and condemned the use of medically important antibiotics for use as growth promotants in the industry. So the vast majority of antibiotics produced in this country don't go to people, actually is funneled into animal agriculture, and not to treat sick animals or even to necessarily prevent sickness, but is used as a growth promotant. The environments that most animals are produced in the United States is so filthy. Their immune system is so embattled by pathogens that it takes so much kind of metabolic energy, growth energy, to fight off all these bugs that their growth suffers. So if you give them antibiotics to wipe out the bugs, you put it in the water supply on a mass level in these chicken sheds, and then you just wash these chickens internally, externally with antibiotics, then their body no longer has to fight off so many bugs because it's just such an unhygienic environment that they have a growth spurt. They actually grow faster than they would otherwise because, again, of these conditions. And so it saves money. But again, at what cost? It saves money for the select few, for the industry, and maybe for the consumer down the road, but at what cost? We are now facing a future in which a simple scrape can turn into a mortal wound, where, simple surgeries can be anything but simple. We are running out of an arsenal of antibiotics. We cannot invent antibiotics fast enough to combat these bacteria that are multiplying and reproducing much faster than our ability to fight infection. So as a physician myself, even just from when I started my practice years ago, I'm finding people coming in with infections, people coming in with urinary tract infections, people bringing in their children with respiratory infections. The first line drugs no longer work anymore. In fact, often we have to just jump immediately to the more expensive, the more dangerous, more side effects drugs because we're running out of options.
If you were to design an environment to select out as rapidly as possible the most antibiotic resistant bacteria, you couldn't have designed a better situation than the average poultry CAFO or swine CAFO that uses antibiotics in their feed.
Some of that antibiotic resistance is, on a molecular basis, a class-based resistance. In other words, they resist the entire class of compounds. And the bacteria can swap genes for antibiotic resistance across species. Most folks don't know that.
Now, the industry blames the doctors for overprescribing antibiotics, and that's true. That is a problem. You walk in with the common cold and the sniffles, and you demand an antibiotic from your doctor, and you're not happy until you get one, where, most bronchitis, most sore throats is caused by viruses. It's not helped by antibiotics. And so, yes, overuse within the medical profession plays a role, but the majority, as much as 70% of the antibiotics produced in this country don't see people at all. It goes directly into these animal industries, which use them indiscriminately on a mass scale and have led to the emergence of these strains of bacteria which are resistant, what are called multi-resistant bacterial strains, resistant to half a dozen different drugs, including drugs that are critical for treating pediatric populations.
If you use them for your animals, then you will also find residues in the products, for example, in the eggs, in the meat, and whatever. And of course, they are very small, But if you eat this kind of products for a very long time, they will accumulate in yourself, so that's one problem. And it will cause what you call a resistance again, special antibiotics. And that again does mean if you really need them because you're unhealthy or ill, then they might not work because of the resistance. So that's a bit of a tricky point about it. And that, I think, was one of the main reasons that they said, do we really need them, or don't we produce a very general health problem so that when people get ill, we can't really help them because the substances don't work any longer.
The concern about growth hormones and a number of other stimulants is that they end up being what are called endocrine disruptors. And these endocrine disruptors, when absorbed in the human body, interfere with the normal feedback mechanisms of our estrogen, testosterone regulatory mechanisms. And there's a lot of active research going on, including by some of our faculty in toxicology, on what these endocrine disruptors, how they contribute to problems like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, and so forth.
Obviously, it's not good for the animal's health to be given an artificially stimulating hormone. There's also concerns about human health, and it's not allowed in the European Union at all to do that because of the concerns about human health. And then it also, and that's when you're talking about eating the meat, but there's also a concern about the hormone residues getting into the environment. Right. And in fact, the U.S. Geological Survey did a study a couple years ago where they looked at all the major water bodies around the United States and were testing what was in there, and they kept finding hormone residues, among other things.
Growth promoters have no place in the human food supply. And the industry argues, well, it doesn't appear, they acts on the animal, and then the amounts that may be residue in the meat and milk are trivial. But I think applying the precautionary principle, that is, until you have the data, you shouldn't be subjecting the general population to the potential risk of these so-called endocrine disruptors.
The people who are being affected are family farmers who have farmed for generations, who want to preserve their family farm, and now they're virtually feel imprisoned by these facilities because their property values decline, so they can't move if they wanted to. Most of them don't want to move. It's been their family farm. Their water's being polluted for their livestock. They can't enjoy a quality of life that they were used to because they can't be outside during the summer, they can't have the family barbecues.
The rural residents around here are used to smelling manure, but they always tell me that there's a difference. They says, that is not the dairy smell that we grew up with. This is obnoxious smell. We know the difference. This stuff that we're smelling now has been fermented. It's just gagging, it gags you. If this is considered the future of agriculture, then there's nobody going to be living in rural areas.
Angry. We've worked on this for 6 years, and not one person from the government, the legislators, senators, anyone, the health department, drain commission, governor's office, has stepped up to take liability for what they've created and let they continue to let operate. We have to watch my in-laws suffer every day. They live 800 feet from a CAFO. They spread next to their home. We've continuously sent emails to all the government agencies, but nobody wants to be accountable.
My folks have suffered due to the stench. They choked to death down there. I've spent countless hours down there talking with my parents and tried to assure them that there was the way to get through this. And we've found nobody that'll do anything about this, and they suffer every day. They're in their golden years and they got to suffer with us. They suffer through the harassment, harass them on the phone. They try to intimidate my dad and my mom out of their homes. They try to use the liquid manure as a weapon. It's no different than picking a gun up and shooting somebody. It's liquid manure. They spread it all over you, and they think that you ought to stand there and take it, and they think it's funny. They think that this is the way that they're gonna do things.
Both are regulated. Normally for odor you have kind of guidelines or regulations where you have setback distance regulations, so that you say, okay, I have my facility here, I can calculate how much odor is produced, and by that you need a certain distance around the facility so that you can ensure nobody, there is no nuisance of the neighbors. Right. So for odor you have normally setback distance regulations, and for dust there are thresholds included in our air quality guideline in Germany.
Most people simply have no idea how abused most farm animals really are. And if they did know, they would be outraged. And in the case of chickens, where we have 9 billion of these animals being raised and killed every year for food, they truly are the most abused animals in the world of agribusiness. Whether it's chickens raised for meat, who are bred to grow so quickly that they suffer from all types of leg disorders, heart problems, and lung problems, or chickens who are used for eggs, who are confined in battery cages that are so restrictive that they're unable even to spread their wings. Chickens are treated absolutely horrifically, and it's time for us as a society to begin addressing this serious problem. These birds are shackled upside down by their legs, which is painful and terrifying for them because many of them already have bruises, fractures, and broken bones from their violent catching and transport process. The birds are then passed through an electrified bath, which generally only renders them immobile, paralyzed, but not unconscious, not insensible to pain. Then the birds have their throats cut, and those who don't have their throats cut, those who miss the mechanical blade, end up dying by drowning in a tank of scalding water that's designed to loosen their feathers. The current method of slaughtering these birds is absolutely nightmarish, and it needs to come to an end.
The notion that the American food production system is the safest in the world is nothing more than a very big and very convenient lie. Frankly, we don't stack up very well next to the rest of the developed world.
Another set of research studies has shown that Campylobacter, which is a very common bacterial contaminant of chicken, that drug-resistant, antibiotic-resistant Campylobacter prevalence is highest in poultry workers, next highest in their family members, and lowest in the community around the CAFO that is not directly involved. So it satisfies a lot of what we call the epidemiologic rules of evidence in terms of the dose-response curve, in terms of strong correlation with populations at risk. It's a major, major problem.
76 million Americans every year come down with a foodborne illness. You do the math, that's 1 in 4 Americans every year.
But you put 30,000 birds in a barn and don't clean the barn out really well between flocks because you believe that the antibiotics you're adding to the feed will suppress the infections and so forth. And it's a perfect recipe for contamination of the human food supply.
So we are the only country with mad cow disease on the planet that continues to allow the feeding of slaughterhouse waste, blood, and manure to livestock. Only country, even Canada, stopped some of these kind of cannibalistic feeding practices. And in fact, Creekstone Farms actually said, well, we want to test our own cattle for mad cow disease because we export to Japan and they don't want, and they know about our lax regulations. And the USDA stopped them from testing at their own expense their own cattle. So for example, in Japan, they test 100% of all their cattle for mad cow disease, right? Here we test less than 1%. In Europe, test about 25%. All cattle over a certain age. Here, literally less than 1% of cattle get tested.
Well, like most people in the United States, I like chicken, especially fried chicken. But unfortunately, the United States doesn't have a very good record when it comes to the safety, healthiness of our food. Scandinavian countries have virtually eliminated salmonella as a disease in chicken. Consumer Reports study in the United States resulted in a showing of 83% of commercial chicken they tested being contaminated by salmonella or campylobacter or both. Makes it kind of hard to figure out how you ought to approach dealing with your chicken in the kitchen to make sure that there's not any contamination. Of course, representatives of the industry said at a hearing in Arkansas that even if it's contaminated by disease, by cooking it at a high enough temperature, you can kill the bacteria. But they don't tell you to treat everything before and after that like it was medical waste. One wonders sometimes whether maybe the best way to handle this is just simply to take it and forget about it. Maybe I'd be better off with my spinach salad over here. Or then again, maybe not. One of the things that we've learned is that even vegetables and spinach can be contaminated by waste running off from factory farms.
So the poultry industry uses arsenic, mainly in the form of roxazone, because by their calculations it's cost effective. The cost of the arsenic and handling it in the feed and everything else is offset by the gains of growth promotion and quicker time to market for the birds.
The chickens or the broilers are fed that compound for a couple of reasons. One, that it's described as a general growth promoter. That is, I think in eating it, I've read that the chickens' throats are slightly irritated and they want to eat more. But there may be some veterinary reasons. That is, that it reduces the level of certain parasites, certain protozoan parasites in the chicken's guts. And if you aren't spending your chicken energy fighting the parasites, you're putting on chicken poundage. So it makes the chickens add poundage faster.
Arsenic doesn't go anywhere. When it appears in the chicken litter, the poop, it then is spread with the rest of the chicken litter on farmland, and it gets into the groundwater. And we have active research going on now to measure the increasing arsenic rates in the shallow aquifers of the eastern shore. And we know that arsenic, even in very low levels, can be a human carcinogen. Huge problems in Bangladesh, where natural occurring arsenic contaminates most of their drinking water supplies, and they have no solution for that. Now we're in the midst of creating a similar problem by using a carcinogen for growth enhancement in poultry.
On the surface, Prairie Grove, Arkansas looks a lot like a lot of other small towns in America, but it may someday be remembered as one place where the health risk caused by factory farms devastated the lives of ordinary citizens. Chicken waste was routinely spread on land next to the community and directly across the street from its school. Tests of household dust in homes in the town revealed arsenic levels far above those normally considered safe. A number of families have sued poultry companies to hold them liable for the illnesses suffered by their children. One of these was the family of Holly Green, who spent weekdays in her babysitter's home in this neighborhood.
Our kids were very actively involved in lots of different activities. Holly did cheerleading camp, and she was involved in basketball and softball, and my son was involved in baseball, and we were just a very active family.
So we was getting ready to go to, I was helping Whitney in her classroom, getting ready to start the new school year. And people came up to us and said that Holly looked a little yellow. Her eyes, her skin, and of course this is the summer, she had a tan, she's outside all the time playing. I took her to the doctor. I drove from Lincoln to Fayetteville. They took a blood sample, and by the time I got back to the house in Lincoln, they called me and told me I need to bring her back to the emergency room immediately. It was a life or death situation. So I brought her back up there, and they told us that she had cancer. Didn't know what type, just told us we had cancer. And that's when they life flighted her to Children's in Little Rock, and it took them probably a week to diagnose that it was actually T-cell.
Really, she was a very sick little girl for several months. It took about 6 months for her to actually recover from her initial diagnosis and her initial chemotherapy. We traveled to Children's Hospital once every 3 weeks. We just took off praying that we would come back one big happy family.
Then it was just after the chemo, she was just so sick. I mean, you'd sit there and every week, month, I mean, that's all the thing you thought about was her temperature. I mean, you know, that's the main, if her temperature went up, you knew she had an infection. I mean, the only thing you're watching is all the machines on her. And you kind of learn how to read them. But infection set in, and her breathing, she couldn't breathe on her own. And her lungs kept filling up. And she kept
They put her on the vent to do the procedure, and then all her organs pretty much just shut down after that. So we left Seattle without our daughter. We came home with the rest of our family, but she didn't survive.
The doctors told us that there seemed to be a high number of people in Northwest Arkansas, especially children.
And we knew several people at Children's Hospital when we were there, which was what was so weird. People that live across the street from us right now, actually, their son was diagnosed with cancer 1 month before Holly was diagnosed with cancer. We knew them. We were at Children's Hospital and we knew them. A little boy from Prairie Grove was at Children's Hospital the same time we were there. We knew them. We knew Mike and Beth. I mean, how strange is it for that many people to be clustered at Children's Hospital with cancer at the same time? You start connecting the dots and thinking, you know, this child lived here. We lived here. They lived there. They lived there. Look at all these dots we're connecting of all these people who are living in such a close proximity. The information started popping up that it might have something to do with the chicken litter. We just never imagined we were being poisoned by chicken litter, something we'd smelled our entire lives.
No, other than I just don't wish anybody to go through what we went through.
Yeah. When the most precious thing in your life gets taken from you for no good reason, you'll always wonder what it could have been like.
A number of families have filed lawsuits against the major poultry companies who spread their arsenic-contaminated waste next to Prairie Grove. In fact, arsenic-contaminated waste from several poultry companies was laid on the same land. Relying on the fact that the contaminated waste in question came from several companies, the local court dismissed the family's claims against all the companies and stated, quote, "The burden is on the plaintiff to prove that the product applied was a substantial factor applied by a specific defendant." You know, how are we going to decide, other than through speculation, that this is Tyson's or Cargill's or Simmons or Peterson's that is causing these injuries? The dismissal of the poultry companies as defendants left the manufacturer of the arsenic compound as the only remaining defendant. The decision to dismiss the chicken producers as defendants is on appeal. The plaintiffs argue that established precedent requires all of the defendants to be jointly and severally liable, and the defendants are themselves responsible to apportion the damages among themselves. In a study of arsenic contaminants of household dust in Prairie Grove, the authors of the study, published in the scientific journal Environmental Forensics, concluded, quote, "The findings of roxarsone in household dust is the final definitive evidence that broiler litter arsenicals are airborne contaminants in areas of high-density poultry operations, such as those in and around Prairie Grove, Arkansas. The levels of arsenic found in the majority of homes tested are high enough to represent a significant health risk of arsenic-related diseases." Arsenic is not just found in the dust from chicken litter. It has also been found in the meat of chickens sold for consumption by the public.
Well, you know, I think that the issue that probably strikes the greatest fear in my mind is some sort of pandemic or epidemic of disease that works its way through animals, whether it's through birds or other kinds of animals, and then spreads to human beings.
There are a number of emerging infectious diseases over the past few decades that have been tied to these kind of industrial practices. So, for example, mad cow disease, one of the classic examples. There are others, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. But of all the various public health threats, the one that has the potential to be most devastating is the so-called bird flu, avian influenza, and the possibility it could trigger a worldwide outbreak of disease. See, all bird flu viruses start out harmless. Very important to understand. For these bird flu viruses have existed for millions of years as a harmless, waterborne intestinal infection of aquatic birds like ducks. The virus silently excretes into the water from the bird's intestines and is gobbled up by the next duck that swims in the pond, and the cycle continues as it has for millions of years and no one gets hurt. But if you take an infected duck to one of these live bird markets, for example, and stack them in cages high enough to splatter virus-infected droppings on a land-based or terrestrial bird like chickens, then, like a fish out of water, the virus has a problem. No longer has the luxury of easy waterborne spread in the pond, and so the virus must mutate or die. Unfortunately for us, mutation is what influenza viruses do best. So when it finds itself in this land-based host, then it has to mutate to, in the open air, for example, must resist dehydration and may travel to other organs to find a new way to travel. Intestinal spread in the water isn't going to work anymore for this virus, so it finds the lungs. And unfortunately, there seems to be this similarity in the respiratory tract of chickens on a molecular level and our own primate respiratory tract, such that as this virus gets better at infecting and killing chickens, the virus may be getting better at infecting and killing us. When this chicken, infected chicken, is taken from the live bird market and goes back into one of these intensive confinement operations. Over the last few decades, we've kind of effectively Tysonized Southeast Asia and much of the developing world, such that since about the mid-'80s, we've gotten these, we're cramming tens of thousands of animals into these filthy football field-sized sheds to lie beak to beak in their own manure. Just a breeding ground for these kind of diseases. So before, that one chicken would go back to a backyard flock and this virus would not have many hosts to mutate within and spread within. But if you take that unsold chicken at the end of the day back into one of these so-called factory farms, then the virus has billions and billions of opportunities to mutate within each chicken, spread when the next beak is just inches away. There may be no limit to how ferocious this virus can get, and indeed, the emergence of this H5N1 strain of bird flu has unprecedented human lethality. Up to 60 million Americans get the flu every year. What if it all of a sudden turned deadly? This H5N1 currently has a 59% human mortality rate, meaning you don't even get a coin toss as to whether or not you survive with this flu. Now, the flu is not good at spreading from person to person, and not even good at spreading from bird to person. Been around since 1997, only about 150 people have died. But what scientists are concerned about is that this virus keeps mutating and mutates into a form that's easily transmissible from person to person through a breath, a cough, a handshake, and then that would trigger the next pandemic of influenza, which could lead to millions of human deaths worldwide.
Anyone who has ever had an aquarium or a koi pond like this one knows you have to maintain a fragile balance to keep your fish alive and healthy. Too much feed, too many nutrients, too much waste, and the fish will die. Natural environments of rivers, lakes, and oceans are larger, of course, but they too can be and are easily contaminated and destroyed. We send Peace Corps volunteers around the world to teach people to keep sewage out of streams, wells, and drinking water. The United States Army Corps of Engineers maintains hundreds of lakes in the country and prohibits us from dumping human or pet waste off of recreational boats. And visitors to the Grand Canyon and other remote national parks are required to remove all of their own waste when they leave. Yet we continue to allow large corporate factory farms to dump hundreds of millions of pounds of animal sewage on land where runoff takes the sewage directly into rivers and lakes all across the country.
You should look at these as cities of animals, and when you look at the geographic distribution of them, you have a metropolis of animals in eastern North Carolina.
And if we are conservative, if one pig contributes 3 to 10 times more waste than one person, say we use the number 4, then in North Carolina we have the equivalent of about 40 million people's worth of wastes.
We met with Dr. Bert Fisher on Lake Tenkiller in Oklahoma, one of many lakes and rivers across the country that has been seriously damaged by pollution from factory farms.
Human waste has had a mechanism for treating waste coming from concentrations of humans for some substantial period of time. I mean, it's recognized early on when you urbanize a population, you have to do something to control and treat and manage that waste. With respect to confined animal feeding operations such as poultry operations, the waste is just thrown out in the landscape without any treatment at all. So I'd much rather deal with human waste right now. It's more of a known entity. We spend a lot of time figuring out how to treat it and take care of it. With respect to poultry waste, the feeds are amended with phosphorus because the birds grow so fast. They need this extra phosphorus to make their bones strong. But there's so much phosphorus that's fed to them, it goes into the waste itself, is spread on the land and washes into streams, rivers, and lakes and causes them to be highly productive of algae, which is not a good thing. Second thing that it does is that it puts a lot of biomass in the water that ends up yielding organic compounds, which, when the water is withdrawn for drinking water supply, it's withdrawn, it's chlorinated. When that chlorine interacts with that organic matter, it forms compounds called trihalomethanes. A significant one would be chloroform. Chloroform is a carcinogen. So water treatment plants drawing water from bodies like Lake Tenkiller or parts of the Lower Illinois River that have a lot of organic material that's been produced by growth of algae in those systems run a high risk. In fact, it's a nearly 100% probability of generating trihalomethanes at levels that we would rather not be drinking.
And why do we have to feed so much phosphorus to chickens if it is going to create those types of health risks?
Birds are birds. Birds fly. Birds don't calcify all that well. So to build strong enough bones that won't fragment and break up during the processing of the chickens, phosphorus, calcium phosphate is put in their feed, or phosphorus is made available by putting enzymes on the corn-based feed that allow the birds to take up the phosphorus to build their bone mass. We all like boneless chicken, but I don't think we like it before the chicken's been slaughtered and cleaned. So their bones would be too weak to support processing, literally too weak in some instances to support the growing bird. And its bones would break and it would die.
And how fast and how big are we now growing chicken? Well, the University of Arkansas Extension Service claims that if we raised our own children the way we raise chicken, a 2.5-year-old child would weigh 349 pounds. We have already examined the profound destruction caused by pollution from factory farms in Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Michigan, Maryland, and North Carolina. But unfortunately, that story is not confined to those states, but is repeated throughout this country and abroad. The European Union stands virtually alone in adopting strict regulations to manage the health and pollution problems created by factory farms. Indeed, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has issued an alarming report on the vast destruction of the South China Sea resulting from pollution largely created in new factory farms in Thailand and Vietnam. The reality today is utterly frightening. We would certainly be up in arms if most of our major cities, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, St. Louis, and others suddenly stopped treating their sewage and started dumping it untreated into the surrounding environment. Yet the amount of sewage being dumped in the environment by factory farms far exceeds that. Factory farms produce 1.3 billion tons of sewage each year in the United States alone. That's 5 tons for every U.S. citizen, and over 100 times the amount of human waste. That sewage would fill 52 million 18-wheeler semi-trucks. This convoy of sewage would stretch bumper to bumper across the United States 148 times. Instead of requiring the sewage to be handled safely, we allow it to be dumped in vast quantities on land which cannot absorb it.
Yeah, we talk about it in terms of density and the nutrient load on the soil. And if you have too many animals in one place, the soil cannot digest that. It cannot assimilate the nitrogen and the nitrates in that soil, and you have a problem. You actually poison the soil.
What's the density on a certain area of land? And that's also one of the reasons here in Europe or in Germany, people try to keep that link between number of animals and enough area, agricultural or arable area, which let's say will create a good equilibrium between these two.
In terms of waste and so forth.
Yeah,
right.
Of course. You are only allowed to have 2.5 livestock units per hectare, 1 hectare is roughly 10,000 square meters, and that means one livestock unit is equivalent to 500 kilograms of body weight of animals, so that you have a threshold. It doesn't matter if it's poultry or cattle, whatever, that you can say, calculate the number of animals, what's linked to this certain area. And you are not allowed to exceed this number.
A lot of observers thought the industry had reached the apex of its power under the administration of President Bill Clinton. Clinton had been very close to Tyson's and other major factory farming giants when he served as governor of Arkansas. When Archie Schaefer, vice president of Tyson's, was convicted in federal court, Clinton handed him a presidential pardon. A lot of observers didn't think it could get any worse, but they were wrong. Under the administration of George Bush, matters got a lot worse.
Well, EPA, the enforcement group, set national priorities based on where we were seeing the most environmental harm. So CAFOs have been a national priority for some time, historically based on the impacts to water quality. So when I was at the agency, they had been taking cases against CAFOs for violations of the Clean Water Act. However, we started to hear from citizens about air complaints, similar to those that you would hear from people living on the fence lines of chemical plants or refineries, where they're waking up in the middle of the night, having respiratory problems, burning sensation in the nose, eyes, throat. And so we started to explore whether or not these very large operations were also violating provisions of the Clean Air Act and CERCLA and EPRA, which are two federal environmental laws that regulate the releases of hazardous pollutants. Our first case was against a large hog operation in Missouri who was producing 2.5 million hogs every year. And based on our expert evaluation and things, we determined that they were in fact likely violating these statutes. That case settled. We were investigating a couple of other facilities as well, a hog operation in Oklahoma, a poultry operation in Ohio, and it was at that point that I came into work literally one day out of the blue and was told that the staff could not do any more investigations of these operations for violations of the Clean Air Act or EPRA and CERCLA. Purely for political reasons, we had to stop all of our investigations.
Why isn't everybody going just up in arms about this? What's the deal?
Politicians, money talks.
At the end of '98, I was running for re-election. The poultry industry poured a huge amount of money into my opponent's campaign.
We don't have the money to fight on this side of the issue the way they do on the other side of the issue.
Right.
That's really always been my problem as an activist and an organizer, is I've always had to, all my successes were without any money.
The long-term action, however, undertook just a massive battle with the poultry industry.
So I just ran a press release one day, and I said, we need to assess such and such, and let's make sure that the integrators pay for it. The next morning in my office, when I got there at 7:30, there was a lineup of people in my office with tears in their eyes. They were called in the middle of the night and told to get over there and kill this. There was no way that they were going to get to stay in business. Now that's how powerful the Tysons of the world are.
A scientist who took on this industry in the early days, and I didn't mean to take them on, I didn't realize that just reporting surface water impacts of this industry, like every other industry, meant to them that I was an enemy and I was taking them on. I had no idea of that at the time, but I learned that quickly enough. When we reported those impacts, I began to receive death threats, anonymous calls. In fact, 2 of those calls, somehow they found out that I have a little Sheltie, a little dog. And 2 of those calls told me that something to the effect of I'd better watch where my dog was. I wouldn't have her very long.
Just the other day, I had some people from Harvard University over here. We have a grant together with Lead Agency and Harvard School of Public Health to do a health assessment of the area, including Grand Lake and all of the Superfund site. And I took them out in my Riverkeeper boat. It has Grand Riverkeeper on the side of it and everything. And last time I took it out of the water, it took it out dry and there was no problems. So when I launched the boat and got these Harvard scientists into the boat on the Neosho River, and we went about a mile down the river to where we wanted to sample the core sample of the sediments. And water was coming in the boat and I couldn't figure out what was going on. The plug was in, everything was good. I finally pulled up the mat underneath my seat where I drive the boat, and there was a hole all the way through the boat. Then the engine died, and then I had trouble starting the engine, and we were filling up with water. Finally I got it started, got back to the bank and salvaged the boat, got it back up onto the trailer and got it up where I could see it. And there was a perfectly round hole in the fiberglass body right under the steering wheel. And the hole goes from the floorboard, the deck of the boat, all the way through the boat, out the bow. So somebody was hoping I'd get out and sink, you know.
Yeah. When I finished the legislation in '98, and of course I was getting ready for a re-election in '98, and I'd been told that, you know, we're going to get you.
Virtually all of the academic leaders who were willing to talk to us confirmed the power of the industry in dominating academic decision making, and even in determining whether a professor is granted tenure.
That told me that the stakes are pretty high in this game.
Yes, they are.
You know, and I have to keep reminding myself that it's one thing for me sitting with a tenured professorship in a private university.
The University of Arkansas has even gone to the point of announcing it would no longer grant tenure to any of the faculty in the poultry division.
Our land-grant institutions, Oklahoma State University, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas State, they've all bought into this industrial model.
The industry constantly complains about the lack of data, and yet it does everything it can to prevent the collection of data. In the Oklahoma case, lawyers for the industry spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just trying to stop the Attorney General from taking soil and water samples to determine the magnitude of pollution suffered by the state.
The big difference between our lawsuit with the tobacco industry and our lawsuit with the poultry industry today is that when we sued tobacco, the major player, Philip Morris, had about 50% of the market, wanted to reach a settlement. They really wanted to get the lawsuit behind them and to get on with their business. So the giant in the industry was actually pulling the others along with them to reach an agreed settlement in the tobacco litigation. We have almost the exact opposite situation today, where the leader in the industry, Tyson, is one of the most difficult to deal with. They don't want to be in the talks. They don't care to negotiate. They're used to having their own way.
And then we've got this air compliance agreement. Instead of continuing to enforce the Clean Air Act and EPCRA and CERCLA as we were doing under the last administration, they spent 5 or 6 years negotiating what's called this air compliance agreement, where everyone in the industry could sign up. So there were over 2,700 operations that signed up, covering over 13,000 facilities in the country. If you signed up to this deal, you got widespread immunity from the Clean Air Act, CERCLA, and EPCRA in exchange for some monitoring data, which sounds good until you start looking at the details. So the last document that I saw related to this agreement showed that they were only planning to collect data from 17 facilities out of the 13,000 that get this immunity.
It's a shame to say that these integrators, poultry companies, will not do something until they're made to do it. It's cheaper for them to have their attorneys to try to fight it than it is for them to fix the problem.
Even now, what we find is a lot of backtracking. There's emphasis, I think, from the national administration that they're not going to be enforcing this.
I think they've bought themselves a lot of time and continue to employ strategies that then put off the day where they're actually regulated even further.
The industry has spent millions of dollars on advertising, trying to convince the public that they are good corporate citizens. Anytime they are challenged, they spend huge sums attacking their critics and proclaiming their innocence. In Oklahoma, for instance, they have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars attacking the Attorney General, defending their business practices, and presenting their lead operators as hardworking and honest farmers. Two of their lead examples were Gene and Randy Allen. After attacking the Attorney General's actions, the industry ad proudly proclaims that these farmers are only using legal amounts of poultry litters. Quote, "Truth is, they're only applying what the law allows," end quote. Well, the real truth is far different. Records from the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture clearly show that tons of chicken waste were applied to Allen's land that were not properly declared under the law. Allen even admitted under oath in a deposition to illegally transporting human waste that, according to his own admission, contained condoms into the state and spread it on rural land in violation of state law. This is just one example of the grossly misleading feel-good ads that the industry runs to divert attention from its own outrageous practices. The industry often promotes self-regulation and claims that its operators strictly follow state laws prohibiting excessive application of animal waste from factory farms to adjacent land. Sometimes the operators are required to take soil samples to ensure that dangerous amounts of sewage are not being applied to the land. But the industry vigorously resists efforts to independently audit, test, or monitor this critical area.
I found out that they were told, well, we can tell you how to get around having a bad hot soil sample. You know, you just don't take it at certain places.
Right.
And that's what they're trying to get away with today.
Urban dwellers don't necessarily think about where their food comes when they go to the grocery store and don't realize that there are these industrial size operations out there that are our #1 polluters of certain toxic chemicals.
In my opinion, if you love this country, you don't just care about it, you care for it. And this industry doesn't seem to.
We are becoming the dumping ground for this industry, despite the fact that we're supposed to be sort of this first world nation that has the top, regulatory best regulations in the, in the world.
It's not sustainable. What we're doing in agriculture today is not sustainable. This thing is going to break down at some point in time.
The right thing is to stop what they're currently doing. Stop the disposal of waste. The land is not a toilet. The current practice is simply not sustainable.
If millions of pounds of beef were infected with the deadly strain of E. coli, spread to half the country by terrorists, we'd go nuts, right? But when it's done by a Fortune 500 company, ConAgra, it's just business as usual.
Is it too late for us to stop polluting and contaminating the air, water, and land we depend on for our life and the lives of so many other species? We all share responsibility for what has happened. In the words of the old cartoon character Pogo, we have met the enemy and they are us. The damage we have caused is incredibly vast, yet there are signs of hope. A few years ago, Lake Erie was given up as hopelessly polluted, but that has changed dramatically.
In 1974 and into early 1975, I started graduate school at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And I had gone there specifically for the purpose of studying anoxic events and their chemical consequences in Lake Erie, because at that time, Lake Erie was eutrophied, it was polluted with nutrients. But the folks who were worrying about that problem had figured out ways to shut down those nutrient inputs into the lake. And when that happened, it never went anoxic again, and I had to figure out something else to do.
So that's kind of good news in a way, isn't it? That basically when lakes are in horrible conditions and water systems, they can be turned around.
They certainly can. I mean, the physics and chemistry and biology of these circumstances are well understood. We know where all the controls are. It's just a matter of using them.
Right. So is there a difference between what happened there and what's happening here, or is it just a matter of political will?
Well, I think it is a matter of political will. It took quite a bit of political will to enforce the Clean Water Act for point source pollution, that is for sewage, to be sure that did not contaminate waters, and to control the chemistry of detergents, which was a huge problem at the time. But in areas where phosphorus control was put in place, everybody was unhappy with it, but then the outcome, everybody was happy with. The same is true here. We know where all the controls are. It's just a matter of turning the valve, having the political and moral will really to do that.
We can find another turnaround example in the case of the Black Sea. Major parts of the ecosystem of the Black Sea had collapsed in the 1980s, leaving the sea virtually dead to fish and other sea life that had been valued and used for centuries. The cause of the collapse was the runoff from industrial agriculture operations feeding into the sea from the old Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union saw the shutdown of the old industrial farms. The dramatic reduction in pollution resulted in an equally dramatic recovery of the sea, documented in Scientific American, Oceanography, and other professional journals.
If I could wave a wand, I would have the national government set very tight, almost European-style regulations, provide some resources to help, and set a minimum floor, which they will actively enforce to at least give the states a reasonable chance. One last point on that, what we found was that the states are at a disadvantage because these big multi-state, particularly poultry, but it's other dairy and things like this, but for Maryland it was poultry, simply threaten, and they threaten to the legislature, and the legislature then is reluctant to pass these bills. But what they threaten to do is they say, if you impose those type of standards, we will leave.
How can each one of us deal with problems which are so vast and so challenging? As some observers have said, we can vote with our forks. We can raise our own food and buy naturally raised food from farmers' markets. We can purchase products such as Nyman's beef and pork that we know are produced in an environmentally safe manner. That will help, but frankly, that is not nearly enough. As the recent spinach scare has demonstrated, even if you are a vegetarian, you can't count on escaping the risk and damage posed by factory farms. So we need to vote with our ballots as well as with our forks. Do we have the political will? Is change of this magnitude possible in our democracy? The lessons of history can answer that question for us. Prior to Upton Sinclair's exposure of the dangers of the meatpacking industry in the early 1900s, the federal government had never been involved in food safety. The overwhelming public demand for reform overcame the power of special interest in passing those reforms and establishing the modern Food and Drug Administration. For me, the possibility of change is very personal. I served for 18 years as a member of the House of Representatives in the state of Oklahoma. I often observed the power of narrow special interest, but I also witnessed the overwhelming power of public opinion when citizens were aroused enough to demand reform. Democracy can work, but it is not a spectator sport. It demands engagement, participation, patience, and persistence.
I think Our responsibility as leaders, whether elected or community leaders, is say to the average citizen, if you don't want your child wheezing all night with asthma, or you don't want to face an increased likelihood of cancer, you've got to demand a change in public policy right now, starting at the national level, establishing strong minimum standards and aggressively enforcing them.
I think as we produce for a global market, we should also have global rules, but we don't have them up to now. And it's naturally a question of market policy that states won't like to respect further regulations in that area. But I think we will all around the world be forced in future to respect more and more the natural needs, because natural need of the environment, because drinking water has become very restricted worldwide.
What we're simply talking about is doing the right thing that is already done in many, many countries around the world. And those countries certainly have a prosperous poultry industry and cattle and hogs and everything else. And you just put it in there that this is a requirement and must be done this way.
Humans are the only animals I've ever encountered that foul their nest, and then while they're in their nest dying, pound their chest and proclaim their superiority. You know, I've never seen anything like that in nature.
We're facing probably the largest scandal in food production history in modern times. And how we respond to it is going to be determined by our political will and our moral will. And the question is, do we have the will to do what we need to do? Or are we condemned to fulfill the prophecy of the ancient Cree Indians?